students, researchers, alumni, and faculty members from various national institutions, including various IITs, IIMs, NITs, NLUs, and other such institutes across India. It focuses on bringing together the country's best talent and infusing in them a nation first attitude. Think India has always felt a need to bind the students with a nationalist Indian nationalistic string to harness this part of national treasure in furthering the aim of national reconstruction. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Mr. J. Sai Deepak. J. Sai Deepak did his bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Anna University. He later pursued LLB from the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. Starting his career in Sai Krishna Associates, it is indeed heartening to see that today he is an arguing counsel in the Supreme Court of India under his own banner. Over these years, he has over these years, he has specialized in matters related to civil, commercial legislation, intellectual property, competition law, indirect taxation, information technology, consumer protection, and drug regulatory laws. Some of his well known engagements include the Tata Sons versus Greenpeace. He has also represented the state of Madhya Pradesh in the case pertaining to the cease in supply of basmati breeder seeds. Also, an active blogger, he started The Demanding Mistress in 2010. He is also an active contributor to many newspapers and magazines like Swarajya, The Daily Guardian, The Times of India, and others. He is also the member of Indian Collective Trust. No introduction of Advocate Sai Deepak would be complete without talking about his most famous involvement in the case of Sabrimala, where he represented Lord Ayappa and more specifically Chetna and People for Dharma. As was widely reported, from an allotted time of 10 minutes at the Supreme Court, the Honorable Court listened to his arguments for over 2 hours. He is also actively involved in legal and social campaign on the issue of freedom of government control over temples. His argument for the assertion of right of deity is an eye-opening topic. May I now request J. Sai Deepak, sir, to begin with this address kindly. Over to you, sir.
So you are muted.
Sorry. Am I audible? Please let me know if there is any ambience noise which is coming in the way of audibility.
Yes. Yeah. Now it is okay.
It's okay? Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you for the introduction. I have one humble suggestion. As opposed to thinking of this as some kind of an address, lecture, or talk, or monologue, I'll try and keep this as interactive as possible. So I think we have about 1 hour 15 minutes, or about 1 hour 10 minutes. I'll try and keep equal time for question and answers, and perhaps more time for question and answers. I'll try and introduce the topic in as clear and as simple a manner as possible. I'm not sure of the number of students who come from the humanities backgrounds, or even engineering students who have a fair bit of comfort with humanities and other subjects. So I'll try and keep this as lucid as possible without making it too technical. So it's about 5:05 now. So until 5:30, 5:35, I'll stick to my introduction to the topic, give you a basic background, and I hope students will pay attention to the introduction so that they are in a position to ask questions. If you have done your reading already, fantastic. So let me start by explaining why I actually chose the topic, or at least sharing with you what were the reasons behind my decision to opt for this particular topic. For quite some time now, I've been interested in understanding the Constitution less as a lawyer and more as a person who's interested in understanding civilization issues, in trying to understand whether it's possible to get out of the narrow focus of a lawyer to make sense of this document, because the Constitution is the supra legislation, or the ultimate legislation, so to speak, which effectively defines the boundary conditions in which we as a people operate in the country. So the idea was to try and understand the significance of the Constitution as a document in the civilizational journey of Bharat. And that's one of the reasons that I tried to understand this document more as a civilizational document. But of course, you can't call a document a civilizational document unless and until there is some kind of a basis for it. There is some kind of a support or a substantiation for that particular position. So I started reading up more about it. And when I was in the process of reading this up, I was introduced to the literature surrounding this concept, this phenomenon, this process, this framework called decoloniality by a brilliant scholar from the United States, an Indian scholar from the United States, Ms. Indu Vishwanathan, who then suggested that I must take a look at the literature surrounding this particular framework to understand and make better sense of what is it that I was doing, because she felt that my work was effectively in the same direction as decoloniality. So we as Indians have always heard of colonization, decolonization, but colonialism, and coloniality and decoloniality, these are very different things. If they may be related, there is certainly a nexus, but they have very different connotations altogether. I think there's a bit of disturbance. I don't know from whose end. May I request someone to, I don't know who, you'll have to mute your mics, please. Yeah, thank you. So when she was kind enough to share with me the literature and even introduce me to that literature, the more I started reading about it, the more I started understanding the relevance of this particular framework to the Indian movement to reclaim its identity, which I don't think has begun now, or nor has it begun from the 80s or the 90s. According to me, it started way back. And the Constitution itself is effectively a product of that particular movement. So what is it that we are effectively talking about? What does it all translate to? Now, societies such as India, which are effectively post-colonial societies to the extent that there is no more a colonizer in India today who is physically present here, who has physically imposed his rule, and who has effectively treated India as a colony as unpaid. Once they gain independence from their colonizers and their colonial masters, these societies go through a state of flux, and that state of flux, how long does it last, entirely depends on the circumstances and the conditions and the degree of awareness that a society has with respect to its identity. And that degree of awareness itself is influenced by its homogeneity or lack of homogeneity, its composition, the multiple forms of colonialism that society may have been subjected to. So one of the reasons that we hold this belief, a lot of educated Indians end up believing that India as it exists today is effectively an artificial creature, which is the product of the stitching together of the country by the British, prior to which we did not have an identity or a self-conscious of our own, is largely a product of ignorance is one aspect, but there's no point in blaming people for ignorance if they've not been exposed to that, to the history or the reality of India, through their history curricula, through schools, through textbooks, at least in their advanced days. When students or people do not have exposure to the history of this land, it effectively translates to an impression in their minds that this country is the product of an external, let's say, benefactor who has put together this country. And until then, we were not a single political unit, we were not a single cultural unit, and we were certainly not a civilizational unit. That seems to be the impression in the minds of a lot of people today. I'm not trying to talk down to them. I'm not trying to tell them that they're wrong. I'm not trying to tell them you should know better. All I'm trying to say is that there is enough literature which exists in the public domain now, thanks to the internet, which makes it possible for people to read and form different opinions and arrive at different conclusions. And perhaps one of those reasonable and plausible conclusions could be that India or Bharat is not an artificial construct. It is not an artificial society. It's not an artificial political unit. It has always existed as a single cultural civilizational unit for several millennia, not just centuries, several millennia, which is clear from its own sources, which is also clear from the manner in which people saw this part of the world, this particular geography, and how they understood that this particular geography has a distinct identity of its own. So one, there are sources which have their origins in India, then there are sources which have their origins abroad. But both these sources, when they look at this particular subcontinent, when they look at this particular geography, are very, very clear that there is something unique about this particular geography that makes it distinct, that distinguishes it from the rest of the world, not just in terms of the variety, not just in terms of the diversity, but the common unifying strand that that effectively ties all these diverse identities and makes them one single unit. That's not the same as they're saying that they're one homogeneous unit. They are unified in a civilizational manner, but they have diverse expressions, but they ultimately trace their origins to a single thought or a single idea, which is the idea of Bharat. Now, the reason why this becomes relevant is a lot of post-colonial societies in Latin America, in Africa, and other parts of the world have managed to find their identities, or at least have managed to put together a particular course or a journey towards reclamation of their identity, so that their identity is not defined by the definition given to them by the colonial master. So that India is not defined by what the white British man thought of India, but it is defined more by its own voices, by its own sources, by its own traditions, by its own ways of life, and its own individual expressions of values. So that is something that effectively describes the sum and substance of this movement of decoloniality. There are several scholars of this particular thought process. Some of the widely known scholars, or at least one of the most widely respected scholar of this particular school of thought, goes by the name Walter de Mignolo, who comes from Latin America, who has written extensively on this particular subject. And he effectively started looking at this particular concept of decoloniality as an attempt by indigenous societies and post-colonial societies to try and reclaim their identity and also reclaim their indigenous epistemology, which is their indigenous approach to knowledge, their indigenous approach to social organization, their indigenous approach to political organization. Because today, when we speak of the constitution, when we speak of democracy, when we speak of secularism, when we speak of republic, when we speak of a parliamentary form of democracy or an electoral democracy, whether or not those thoughts or the seeds of those thoughts existed prior to the Englishman introducing to us, the fact remains that today we effectively see these values and these institutions as British imports or Anglican imports. And the definitions that we subscribe to when it comes to what is an ideal institution, how is it supposed to function, what constitutes a healthy democracy, all these ideas and all these thoughts effectively come from outside. I'm not saying therefore they must be rejected. I'm not saying therefore decoloniality translates to xenophobia, where you're supposed to reject everything that's foreign or alien. I don't think that's even the purpose or the object of decoloniality. The object of decoloniality is to effectively understand the process of assertion of the native identity by asking for itself the right to define who it is, the right to define what is right for itself, the right to define what is right and good for its society, and the right to define every value which the world takes for granted, not just define, sometimes even reject those values. Okay, so while there have been several movements across the world, I think there is very little attempt that has gone into understanding how India as a society has attempted to reclaim its definition, reclaim its origins, reclaim its consciousness as to who it is and where it comes from. Now, that process has been severely muddled, according to me, in identity politics. It has been muddled in a lot of insistence on pixelating certain aspects of history because it hurts minority sentiments or majority sentiments or whatever it may be. But there are very few scholarly attempts to actually look at how we have chosen to define ourselves, what is the basis of this country, if this is truly such an artificial construct which has been stitched together forcibly by the British, or let's say by the Constitution. Why is it that India has not seen as many armed rebellions to secede from this country? Given the size of its population, given the number of diverse dialects, the number of diverse identities, the number of diverse, let's say, features and whatnot and ways of life, why is it that India is not at the brink of a civil war constantly in the last 72, 73 years of its existence as a modern independent republic, as a single political unit? The answer to that lies perhaps in two or three things. One, of course, by and large, regardless of which part of the country we speak with, there is an element of coexistence. But that element of coexistence is not the cause, but is the effect. The cause, perhaps, is the fact that we have lived together side by side, notwithstanding our individual expressions, for several generations, for several thousand years. And that is largely because we have interacted with each other. There is a distinct cultural unity. So when we speak of decoloniality, this is something that we must try and understand. But most importantly, what does that concept speak of? What does that concept refer to? The manner in which a country expresses itself in the most public manner possible, in the most visible manner possible, is the manner in which it arranges itself as a political unit, the manner in which it arranges its institutions of the state, such as the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, and the manner in which it draws from its indigenous ideas when it comes to concepts of justice, concepts of truth, concepts of what is right and what is wrong, morals, ethics. So, for all practical purposes today, when we look at the Indian judiciary, or when we look at the Indian legal system, or the Indian political mindset, for the better part of the 70 years, it has believed in copying and imitating from Western institutions, as opposed to asking for itself whether there are enough and more examples, whether there are enough and more institutions and, let's say, thought processes which India can draw from and which India can use to build its own institutions. So whenever we think of India, we effectively see it as an independent country which still has its own. I'm sorry, I think somebody is trying to present something. I would request people to not interrupt this. I'm so grateful. Thank you. So whenever we think of India, the one thing that immediately comes to the minds of most youngsters today is that India doesn't have anything of value or anything or anything which is original to present on the world's table of thought when it comes to the concept of justice, when it comes to the concept of constitution, when it comes to the concept of democracy, so on and so forth. How much of these opinions are actually based on reading? How much of these opinions are actually based on scholarly understanding? How much of these opinions are based in reality and facts? That's, I think, a very serious question to ask, because I don't think there is enough literature or there is enough scholarly effort that has gone in this particular direction. There is one particular book that I would certainly recommend strongly, and I would request students read. Although I don't completely agree with the book, but there are elements of the book which are very, very compelling. There are elements of the book which are extremely brilliant in the research that it has done. So there is a book called Talking Back by Sabyasachi Mukherjee. And this particular book, the complete title is Talking Back, the Idea of Civilization in the Indian Nationalist Discourse. And this particular book is available on Kindle. It's barely 200 pages, and I think it's worth reading. It's a very refreshingly relevant book, something that tries to understand whether Indians, when they were fighting for their independence, when they were trying to put together a country called Bharat, when they were trying to secure independence from the Britishers, on what basis did they want to be a political unit, a single political unit? See, at the end of the day, there were about 500 to 600 princely states around that particular time. What is it that convinced each and every one of these states to become part of the Indian Union? India may have used force with respect to one or two states, but the better part of the accession to the Indian Union was largely and predominantly peaceful. It was voluntary. It was unilateral in several cases. So why would people want to join a big unit when it is possible for them to survive as independent units, when it is possible for them to say, I don't want to be a part of any other country. As a princely state, I've managed to survive all these years. I don't see why is it that I wish to be a part of the Indian Union. So there could be political considerations, there could be economic considerations, there could be geostrategic considerations and whatnot. But the one consideration that did play a role is that these princely states, notwithstanding the fact that they were independent political units, saw themselves as part of a single civilizational tapestry. Better part of them, at least most of them, not all of these princely states necessarily agreed, because a lot of these princely states and a lot of these regions, so to speak, ultimately went on to become parts of Pakistan. So that's a different issue. But for India, the seventh largest country, so to speak, to come together as a consequence of accession of multiple hundreds of princely states, couldn't have been entirely because of force, couldn't have been entirely because of economic considerations or other considerations. One of the significant considerations that went into creating this political creature called Bharat is effectively a civilizational unity. Now, is there any literature that speaks of this? Is it something that people are trying to invent? Is there some concrete basis for this in the Constitution and documents prior to the Constitution? There are multiple books written by indigenous historians who have understood and the spirit of this land, who have sourced the origins of Bharat as a civilization from documents which relate to Indian history. Those documents which we understand as religious scripture are effectively documents which are historic in nature or historical in nature, such as the Rigveda, the Upanishads, the Puranas, and whatnot, which have captured the journey of this particular civilization at different points in time and its evolution both as a civilization and its evolution both as a geography. So the concept of India, or the idea of Bharat, so to speak, has not always been the same. It has started expanding over a particular point of time, and as time went by, the geographical spread of India was identified as that landmass which is bounded by the Himalayas in the north and the Indian Ocean to the south. And to the extent that it finds reference in the Vishnu Purana, it finds reference in the Vayu Purana, and so many other documents. And this is something that indigenous voices, which are making a case for Indian nationalism, Indian civilizationism, and Indian statehood before the British, were basically saying, you can't reject our claim to statehood, you can't reject our claim to being a nation, because you don't understand our history, you don't understand where we come from. You look at us with disgust, you look at us with contempt, and you look at us through your colonial prism. Therefore, you look at us as savages and brutes who need your help to be civilized and to be taught the way of life. But we have enough literature which effectively shows that we were one people, we were a vastly proud and ancient civilization and an advanced civilization which has taught the world a lot of things. So therefore, kindly don't tell us that we are defined by your definitions of us, and we have the right as well as the capacity, as well as the literature, as well as the experience, the civilizational experience of defining ourselves as a people. So on this particular issue, I've tried to understand if, let's say, when the Constitution was being drafted and the Constitution was being put together between 1946 and 1950, were the framers of the Constitution aware of this particular sentiment? They may not have been aware of the concept of decoloniality, or maybe the term was not being used. I'm not sure of it exactly. But in spirit, were they clear about the fact that they were reclaiming the right to redefine India and rid India of its colonial definitions? The more I read about the Indian Constitution and the history surrounding the drafting of the Indian Constitution, it becomes very, very clear to me that the framers of the Constitution were absolutely aware of the origins of this country. They were absolutely aware of the history of this country, and they were clear that when they used the word Bharat as part of Article 1 of the Indian Constitution, there was a clear civilizational significance to it. They were effectively saying that this modern democratic Republic of India is the successor state to the Bharatiya civilization. It is a civilizational state. Now, as part of some of my writings, in fact, in the Daily Guardian, on which I've been writing for the past 6 weeks now, I've been building on this particular idea. I've been trying to contribute to this particular thought process by supporting it with as many sources as possible, by supporting it with as many arguments as possible. The column is called Indic Views, and it is published as part of this page called Legally Speaking in the Daily Guardian every Friday. Those who are interested and those who think it's worth their time are welcome to read that series and try and understand how I've tried to build this particular argument. So that's something that you may want to do. Now, ultimately, what is the goal of decoloniality? What does it try to do? Notwithstanding the fact that the British colonizer left us in 1947, what has happened is that between 1951 or perhaps 1952, after the first general elections were held, successive governments have effectively moved away from the spirit in which the Constitution was drafted, from the spirit of decoloniality. There has been very little attempt to find our own definitions for a lot of things, surprisingly, after the Constitution was drafted. So the Constitution as a document tries to build the concept of Bharat and the basis for Bharat in Bharatiya terms, in civilizational terms, drawing from its independent sources. But successive establishments which effectively led the Indian state, so to speak, which represented the Indian state and the Indian government specifically speaking, has put very little effort, be it in terms of drafting of history curricula, drafting of policies, to draw from indigenous jurisprudence. When it comes to environment, when it comes to concept of gender justice, when it comes to concepts of social justice, when it comes to concepts of, let's say, industrial policy, when it comes to approach to trade, entrepreneurship, geosecurity, national security, armed forces, and whatnot, Since, I mean, how many of us can confidently say that Bharat is relying on its own schools of thought to actually craft policies in each of these areas? We either look at an Israel or an America or a United Kingdom or a Germany or a Japan or a Canada or a South Korea or any other country, but we still don't seem to have the confidence to draw from our own sources, because we somehow we have managed to convince ourselves that there is nothing of value that we are in a position to contribute to anything which is contemporary. There is nothing of value which we can contribute to, which is anything which is relevant. That there is no way that we can apply those thought processes to current day problems. What is even surprising, let me give you perhaps the most brazen and blatant example during the pandemic, which I think people can Google and find out. The Chinese have confidently used Chinese schools of medicine to tackle the pandemic. They have gone ahead and employed their schools of medicine at a nationwide scale to deal with corona. But how much of an effort do you see coming from the Indian government, notwithstanding whatever it calls itself, whichever party it may come from? I don't think they have the confidence or the vision or the depth for it. How many of these people have actually given support to the Ayurveda School of Medicine, the Siddha School of Medicine, the Unani School of Medicine, or homeopathy, or whatever it may be? An entire ministry called the Ayush Ministry was set up under the previous government, under the Congress government, so to speak, under the UPA government. However, so far we have not seen an active push for indigenous medicine, even in the times of a pandemic, when my reading of the literature and my discussion with experts, subject matter experts, tells me that even for a normal fever, there are close to 5,000 to 6,000 compositions in Ayurveda, recognized compositions which can be used to treat various forms of fever. And when, apart from Ayurveda, you have several schools of Indian medicine, why hasn't the Indian government deemed it fit to actually use those schools of medicine to deal with corona? According to me, it is not just lack of wherewithal, it's not just lack of capacity or resource. Fundamentally, there's a problem in the mind space with respect to the confidence with which you can fall back on your own sources. That is also because we have systematically killed our indigenous schools, our indigenous ways of teaching. We have systematically killed an entire epistemology, an entire form of production of knowledge and dissemination of knowledge, because that entire system has been hijacked by caste politics. Every time you discuss the concept of an ancient Gurukula, it is inevitable that you find yourself discussing caste politics. I'm not saying that the discussion on caste politics is wrong, because if there is something that was wrong, and if there are aspects of it which needed to be addressed, it should have been addressed. However, what we have done is that we have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, which is to say, if the system has a problem, don't just work on the problem, destroy the system altogether and kill the system altogether, to the extent that there is no trace of the system altogether in this country. It has been pushed to the brink of extinction. So the one thing that we don't ask ourselves is that when we did not have all these tools of architecture, all these advanced mathematical concepts which civil engineers use today, how did these people manage to create all these wonderful examples of architecture, not just in some part of the country, across the country? And there seems to be a civilizational unity with respect to the architecture across the country. They seem to draw from the same set of sources. Somebody draws a Sagar Manthan in the north, and there is a Sagar Manthan in the south. Somebody depicts Mahabharata in the north, there is Mahabharata in the south. Again, in the east and west, there is some kind of a similarity. So the point is, this civilization has been talking to itself. Several parts of these civilizations have been talking to themselves. Way before the British came or anybody else came, it is inconceivable that Odia-speaking members of the civilization were not talking to Telugu-speaking members of the civilization, because at the end of the day, they were neighbors. They had to conduct trade. They had to indulge in transactions. There was intermarriage. People kept moving from one part of the country to another part of the country. How did they manage to do that? What was the level of comfort with which they moved from one part of the country to another part of the country? If history is right, then Adi Shankaracharya traveled the length of this and breadth of this country at least for 7 times before the age of 32. And there was no impediment to his travel. He did not feel that he was an outsider when he went to either Uttarapatha or Dakshinapatha, or the left or the right, the east or the west or the north or the south. That clearly shows that in our headspaces, we were crystal clear that while there may be political boundaries by way of Janapadas, so to speak, as a civilization, we are one. So the problem, I think, is largely a lack of investment, a lack of scholarship, a lack of confidence, fundamentally a lack of confidence in the Indian state to invest in reclaiming its identity and to invest in indigenous production of knowledge. Nobody is saying, and I don't think I'm going to say, given that I'm speaking English when I interact with you, that destroy English, eliminate English, ban English, prohibit English. I don't think that's feasible. I don't think that's workable anymore. However, is it not possible that as part of a decolonial approach, we try and make sure that there are enough professional options for regional languages, and we also try and see how do we try and create more language awareness in different parts of the country. A discussion on decoloniality is not a discussion against someone, it is a discussion primarily which looks inwards. You're effectively looking at yourself and saying, regardless of who says what about me, regardless of the labels that the world puts on my forehead, and regardless of all sorts of tags that are put on my identity, what do I know of myself? What do I think of myself? Who am I is the basic question. And the question is not meant to exclude people from this country, is not meant to exclude or drive away people from this country who don't fall within the scope of their identity. India, as a political reality today, is a composite mixture. There is no doubting that at all. However, it has an origin, it has a past, and we have to ask ourselves, does the present effectively require you to negate your past? If yes, why? What is the basis for it? Which country says that merely because I have more and more people coming from different cultures and different faiths, I must necessarily destroy my identity, I must destroy my origins, I must never speak of my origin because that will hurt or offend the sentiments of a minority? Do you stop talking about your origins or your family or about your ancestry merely because there are other people you're sharing space with? No. And merely because you're speaking of your past doesn't mean that you don't want others to be a part of this particular land or this particular society anymore. Unfortunately, this entire discussion surrounding colonialism, coloniality, and decoloniality has been extensively hijacked by politicization and communalization of identity politics. There is no discussion that is possible in India today which is free, which is frank, which is fair, which is reasonable, which is factual, devoid of any political tax. I'm going to be accused of saffronism, I'm going to be accused of fascism, I'm going to be accused of majoritarianism, I'm going to be accused of everything under the sun, as opposed to trying to understand the central point that I'm trying to make, which is all those who respect this land's civilization and all those who wish to be a part of this country in a peaceful way are welcome to be a part of this country. However, kindly do not take away the right of the native to effectively say, this land has a certain origin, its culture has a certain origin, there is a culture that has taken birth in this land, and therefore there is something called as a native culture, and there is no reason to run away from it, because to evade that, to escape that particular idea, to evade that particular argument is nothing but intellectual dishonesty. So these are certain things which a discussion around decoloniality throws up. So let's think of it this way. Whenever students have the time and whenever participants of this particular session have the time, kindly read the National Education Policy, the draft National Education Policy that this government has put together, the current government at the center. And I was aghast to read the particular policy because it is so apologetic about its own history, it is so apologetic about Indian history. All these days, there was a standard political accusation that the previous dispensation, the UPA dispensation, does not have the guts to own this country's history or does not want to identify this country with a specific culture. And therefore, the opposite camp used to say, when we come to power, we will tell you what is the true history of this country. In the last 6 years of this government, I don't see any effort that has been invested by the government in addressing issues with respect to history, in presenting more options before students so that they can form their own opinions. See, I don't think it makes sense to effectively treat history as a form of propaganda, as a form of an agenda, because no matter how much you try and push a certain propaganda, the truth has a way of presenting itself. The truth will any day come out, how much ever you try to suppress. In the day of the internet, in the day of multiple sources, there is no way that you can hide anything. People know that sometimes what they read in the textbooks is absolute BS. It has no basis whatsoever. And what they find in independent sources makes much more sense to read. So when that is the case, as opposed to imposing certain versions of history, why not present facts before students? Why not present facts before the people? And let students and the young generation draw its own opinions as to what do these facts mean? What is the story that these facts effectively convey? What is the picture that emerges from these facts when we connect independent dots, when we connect different dots from the east, the west, the north, and the south? Is it possible to say that we were never a single civilization? How is it that songs relating to Krishna are performed in Manipur? How is it that the dance Manipuri effectively speaks of the Radha Krishna Leela? How is it possible? After all, Krishna effectively is seen as a deity of the Hindi heartland and whatnot. But why is it that Rama is celebrated in the south? When Rama is effectively pictured or let's say portrayed as the so-called North Indian Aryan god and whatnot, how many Ramaswamis and Ramanujams do you want from the south in the names of the people, regardless of which caste or whichever group they come from? Ramaswamy is perhaps the most common name which one can come across in the south. And you have the Rameshwaram, of course. So the point I'm trying to make is that the excessive communalization of these discussions, where we push religion so much into these discussions, has effectively taken away the sense of objectivity with which we look at facts. We just look at facts. How is it that so many places across the country feature in our leading epics, namely Mahabharata and Ramayana? Whether they were true or not is not for me to comment, for the simple reason that I'm not a student of history. I believe in them as a practitioner of this particular faith. That's a different issue altogether. However, what certainly makes a difference to me is that there has been an attempt on the part of several writers, indigenous voices, to effectively connect different parts of the country to say that we are one civilization, to try and forge a sense of unity. I'm sorry, there is a disturbance. May I request someone to either mute their mics or reduce the volume? I'm so sorry. It's interfering with my flow of thought. Manu Gupta, I think, will need to. I'm so sorry. Thank you. I'm so grateful. Yeah. So I could have taken this discussion easily in a political direction. It is not my intention to actually politicize this particular discussion. I'm asking students in my interactions, I'm asking students wherever I go and talk, to try and take an interest in first reading first-hand literature, in equipping themselves with enough ammunition, so to speak, in terms of arguments. Read, read, and read. And there is so much of literature that was produced between 1919 or in fact 1913, before the First World War, by Indian historians until 1947 or even after that, which clearly shows that there is so much of literature that this generation has not been exposed to. Several authors, Radhakrishna Mukherjee, VVS Iyer, Radhakumar Mukherjee, VVS Iyer, then H.B. Sarda, so many people who have written with training, with a lot of first-hand scholarship, with a lot of training in those schools of thought, so that they were in a much better position to speak with conviction and confidence when they were talking of Bharatvarsha, the concept of Bharat, so to speak, and where it emerged from. So these are certain schools of thought, and these are certain, let's say, I would say people must be exposed to this particular literature. So my efforts as someone who takes an interest in these issues has been to try and understand from this literature as much as I can and share it with students in a language that they understand today, in today's idiom. When I try and tell them that decoloniality is not a movement which encourages hatred, which is not a movement that encourages xenophobia or a phobia of any particular thought process or a faith system, but it is effectively saying there is something of value and there is something of origin that has come from this particular country. So kindly respect that. Every society has had a journey which is full of pitfalls, which has a lot of flaws, but every journey is evolutionary in nature. There is not a single society which can claim that at the outset when it was established it was perfect and there was no further work needed and there was no further change needed in it. Because if that's the case, why did it fall? Why did it crumble? Why did it lose value? Why does it lose relevance? So think of this particular process as a cyclical process where every society goes through this phase of, it's not just a sine curve. According to me, it's a cyclical evolution. So if possible, notwithstanding whichever profession you may wish to specialize in, whatever career path you may have chosen for yourself, I started off as an engineer, took up law as a profession, and the more I started reading about the Constitution, it has pushed me to read more about history. It has pushed me to read more about civilizational aspects. about geostrategic aspects, about aspects of international law, about aspects of international influence on domestic politics and domestic culture. So it's impossible in my profession, despite my standing as a commercial lawyer and as a constitutional lawyer, to not read anything outside of the law, because at the end of the day, law represents a certain thought process of a certain culture in terms of what is right and what is wrong, and what is legally permissible and what is legally impermissible. Therefore, it is impossible to separate a legal question from a historical question, from a social question, or a political question. So that's been my limited training so far. I've been in the profession for 11 years, but this realization has happened only over the past 5 or 6 years. So I'm trying to share that realization with as many students as possible, asking them or urging them and requesting them to read much more than their comfort zones. Just because you have a point of view, please don't limit yourself to reading only those points of view or those authors who endorse your point of view. Try and read literature that comes from the opposite point of view. See if there is a way that you can try and build a common ground. Because let me try and be a bit provocative here, and if it hurts your sentiments, that's okay, because I think that's the effect of free speech. I think campus politics and discussions on campuses have become extremely monochromatic over the last 15-20 years. People don't want to engage with each other. When somebody tries to air a certain point of view, he's gagged, he's shut up, he's isolated. It is effectively like operating with a kind of an academic mafia. Pardon me for using this language. I'm trying to say, please don't make these mistakes of the previous generation. Talk to each other, whether you think a certain theory is founded or unfounded, whether you think that a certain concept has relevance or not. Don't let your opinions prevail over facts. At least try and read, at least try and marshal as many factual basis for your position before you finally say, yes, I've arrived at it. Because you see, at the end of the day, even scholars who have been spending their entire lives and livelihoods dedicated to this particular work have not been able to come at a clear-cut conclusion, or have not been able to confidently say, yes, this is it, this is final, because it's work in progress. Each time you try and dig up a certain archaeological site, it throws up something either to support you or to disprove you. So therefore, it is going to be a work in progress. So when scholars have not made up their minds and they're still talking about it and they're still exploring the particular concept, it makes very little sense for laypersons who are not scholars in that particular subject, who are not even trained in the particular subject, to arrogantly and cockily effectively say that what we know is final and beyond this there is nothing worth knowing. Anybody who holds a different point of view is a bigot, is a fundamentalist, is a fascist and whatnot. So these are terms, according to me, which are used to shut up discussion, to stifle a dialogue, and to kill conversations. So whichever campus you may come from, whatever position that you may hold, either from a cultural standpoint, a political standpoint, or an ideological standpoint, the sum and substance of my cogitation on issues such as decoloniality is, it must start a conversation, a productive conversation, a transparent conversation, and most importantly, an honest conversation in multiple levels. College campuses, in media, in courts, in let's say, a popular culture, whenever we depict a certain community, whenever we talk of a particular idea or a certain identity. So that's my basic background, so to speak. As promised, now it's 5:45. I open the floor for questions. I will take questions for close to half an hour, from 5:45 to 6:15. So I'd request Animesh or the moderators to effectively moderate the questions. Whatever questions that you want me to answer, I'll answer. Please ensure that whatever questions look uncomfortable, please ensure that those questions also get an opportunity to be asked. I'm happy to answer any question. If I have the answer, I'll respond. If I don't, I'll admit that I don't know the answer.
Thank you for your talk, Mr. Sai Deepak. Recently, the Andhra Pradesh government had taken a decision that they will discontinue the use of Telugu medium schools, like in government schools. So, what do you think about that? Like, I have seen a lot of people saying that because all higher education is happening in English, and like even our conversation has happened in English, so like they're saying that what is the point of having Telugu medium schools? Like, can you please share your views on that? Thank you.
Yeah. So I myself come from a low middle class family, and I am a product of Andhra Pradesh state, but undivided Andhra, of course, because when I completed my 12th, that was in 2002, Andhra Pradesh was at least 12 years away from the bifurcation that happened subsequently. So having done my education from that particular state, and also done my engineering from Tamil Nadu, there's something that I want to share, which is uh, students educated in Telugu and English medium invariably turned out to be students who were fantastic and fabulous when it comes to the sciences. On mathematics, physics, and chemistry, their understanding was brilliant because these guys were understanding the subjects in their own mother tongue. I'm not saying that learning in English effectively makes you stupid or dumb when it comes to these subjects. However, there was something very intuitive in the manner in which they took to these subjects and the manner in which they grasped these subjects. Their handicap was not that they did not have the brains to understand English, but because the rest of the world was imposing on them an English-oriented approach with respect to even the sciences. Okay, so there are 2 or 3 scholars who've been working on such issues, and I've had an opportunity to follow what they have said and what they have done. So I can't claim to be an expert on this particular subject. So Professor C.K. Raju and Mr. Sankrant Sanu, both these people have been advocating for a change in the language policy. Apart from a change in the language policy, it makes very little sense to merely change the language. I'll tell you why. Changing the language policy would mean that what you learn in English, it gets translated to Telugu or whichever mother tongue that you speak, and ultimately you learn the same thing in your mother tongue. But the fact is, the approach to knowledge and the approach to education, the approach to teaching is something that has to be Indianized. The system which was effectively introduced by the missionaries and the Englishmen during, let's say, the colonial rule is the system that we continue to follow for the significant part of our education system today. And there has been no attempt to at least deviate from that script, to deviate from the template and ask, can we teach differently? Are students who come out from our schools today capable of expressing themselves with confidence in whichever language? Why just English? Is it possible for them to express themselves? Is it possible for them to think originally on a certain point? I think that language plays a huge role in it, and it would be a mistake to kill the native medium of education or the native languages in which education is taught. English must find a certain space for the simple reason that it becomes a lingua franca. But even then, there are countries which have survived without English. When China speaks to the rest of the world, it doesn't speak in English. But people might say, you see, China is largely homogeneous. One, it's not, even in terms of languages. But yes, I don't think any country comes close to India's diversity in terms of languages. There can't be any kind of arguments. Perhaps you compare yourself with Europe in terms of saying, they don't have one single language. They have managed to translate each other's works. They talk to each other. What is it about India that makes it impossible for us to think that we can't have professional courses being taught in our native languages, that there is no room for it? Not every person necessarily goes abroad to practice. There are so many doctors and teachers and lawyers and professionals who work in tier 2 cities and tier 3 cities and in cities which are not exactly urban. Is English relevant for all of them? Why just in rural centers? Please come to Delhi. If you come to Delhi, go to the district courts. Please tell me if English is respected or even valued in district courts in Delhi. That is not the first language, that's not the language of first choice. It's either Hindi, that's the language in which they speak. If you go to the district courts of Maharashtra, or the district courts of Tamil Nadu, or the district courts of Andhra Pradesh, English is not necessary. In fact, it's even looked down upon. If you speak in English in those courts, they'll effectively say, where does this guy come from? Who does he think he is? Okay. So the professional relevance of native languages continues to be applicable in certain fora. I think the greatest casualties would be the engineering streams and the medicine streams, where native languages have been completely wiped out from the scope of relevance. They don't figure at all. They don't feature at all. So there has been no attempt. So language policy is certainly important, but knowledge policy is the larger universe within which you must locate language policy. Left to myself, or at least given a choice, I would basically say our students must have the option of learning professional courses in at least 2 languages, either in English or a language of their choice, which is, let's say, the native language, hopefully. And they must be comfortable with a 3rd Indian language, so that they know more than one Indian language. They're familiar with that, because that's the way you integrate a multilingual society. That's the way you bring together multilingual people. Otherwise, the division of the country on a linguistic basis has already done a lot of damage, where we now have separate linguistic identities. There is not a single princely state which had a single linguistic identity, largely speaking. There could have been certain exceptions. But because of multilingual populations which were within those political borders, people and administrators were expected to be comfortable with a lot of languages. I come from Hyderabad. There is a huge Marathi population, there is a huge Kannada population, there is a Malayalam there is a huge Kerala population, Tamil population, and this is effective, and Gujarati, Sindhis. It's a cosmopolitan city because the erstwhile princely state of Hyderabad had a huge population coming from different parts. All of them were under the Nizam. So by default, the language that you get to hear in Hyderabad is very, very different. So, or for that matter, even if you look at the political territories of the Madras presidency, from Odisha to parts of Andhra Pradesh, to parts of current day Tamil Nadu, to parts of current day Kerala, to parts of current day Maharashtra, or even Karnataka, these are parts of the Madras presidency. Is it possible that these presidencies were entirely run on the basis of one language? You go even further. The Vijayanagar Empire was not known for either Telugu or Kannada alone, multiple languages in fact, right? Krishnadeva is equally, let's say, co-opted or adopted by people from Telugu side and people from the Kannada side. So the point I'm trying to make is a monochromatic approach to language and one particular state having one particular language is largely the product of independent India. That's not how we have functioned as a civilization. So to answer a broader question, native languages must survive and they cannot be expected to perform only the ornamental role where they're used for speaking at home or for talking to your relatives or talking to your friends. Even that has come down to English now. You've started thinking in English, which is the worst part, and you have reduced it to certain uses such as festivals and whatnot. Beyond that, you don't have any use for it, for your native language. It's so difficult to find people who are capable of stringing a single sentence in their native language without pausing, without making a single mistake, and without using a word from any other language. That I think is a huge, huge problem. Perhaps we could try and address it. I myself have tried my best to learn my mother tongue better, or when I speak in Hindi in Delhi, I try and keep it as clean and as chaste as possible. I think this requires the state's intervention for a different reason, because when the state has a language policy, it has a multiplier effect. It effectively translates to more and more people being forced to read a certain language for a certain reason. Most people are not even aware that Haryana for a better part of, for a long time had Tamil as its third language, and people from Haryana were expected to learn Tamil. That's something that most people are not aware of. So I think it's important that we try and learn each other's languages. We want to learn German, French, and whatnot, and Spanish. That seems to be the latest fad, but we don't seem to have any interest in learning our own languages. So maybe that's something that we must look into.
Thank you, sir. Another interesting question is that Varun Krishna is asking, how does all this matter? And especially when you were talking about Krishna being depicted in the language of Panyakoli or Ramaswamy, just a minute, or then Ram being discussed in
I think multiple
Chennai or
people
Tamil
are
Nadu.
speaking. Multiple people are speaking. Can one of you mute your mic, please?
And then Varun Krishna goes on to say that he is from Chennai and he doesn't think that, but it could be true for a set of people in Tamil Nadu. Number one, and number two, a follow-up question is, what do you think on the Aryan invasion theory?
Yeah, I just read that. What Varun thinks, frankly, is of no consequence, because I just said that an opinion cannot prevail over facts. Okay? At the end of the day, an individual can say it doesn't matter to me. Sure, it may not matter to you. You don't need to take an interest in something that doesn't matter to you. But surely you don't get to tell others that it doesn't matter to me, therefore it shouldn't matter to others, or it doesn't matter to others. Because at least the state of Tamil Nadu is extremely proud of its identity, both linguistic as well as non-linguistic identities. That much is very, very clear. So when identity matters, to say that some forms of identity matter and some other forms don't matter, I think would be either patent hypocrisy or it is at the very least inconsistency. So I don't think also people from Chennai should effectively speak on behalf of the rest of the state, because when you go to the rest of the state and several parts of the state, either you go to Madurai, you go to Coimbatore, you go to Trichy, or you go to Kanyakumari or Tenkasi or Tuticorin or any of these places, you can see that for them, their identity matters. Therefore, identity has not lost its relevance. Cultural markers have not lost their relevance. Anybody who says that in modern India or in a globalized world, identity has lost its relevance just needs to take a look around the riots that are going on across the world. Identity is the basis for it. Identity is at the heart of it. Identity is the sum and substance of it. Identity is the substratum of it. Therefore, I think we must try and get our heads out of the sand and understand the fact that our so-called claim to cosmopolitanism is effectively a product of ignorance, because we have been effectively deracinated from our own roots. We know so little that we now treat it as a badge of honor, that I don't know anything and therefore it doesn't matter to me. And therefore my ignorance is proof of the fact that I've moved out of these identity markers and have become this global citizen. I don't think that kind of ignorance necessarily should be treated as a badge of honor. It's not a proud thing. It's certainly not something that anybody should be proud of. So that's the first level of the answer. The second level of the answer with respect to the question on Aryan invasion theory. So to answer this particular question, Aryan invasion theory is still untested. It's still unproven. The countercurrents and the counter views with respect to this particular theory are emerging. There is a very strong viewpoint to be spoken for, which is the out of India theory. And this is not something that has been invented by people from within India. There are enough and more proponents of the out of India theory coming from ethnographers, coming from people who have observed civilizational patterns, who have understood migration patterns, who are looking at genetics, who are looking at archaeology, who are looking at linguistics, who are looking at all sorts of markers of a civilization. So there is a fantastic book written by H.B. Sarda on how the seal of the priest king of the Indus Valley civilization continues to be used even after 5,000 years and 6,000 years, much after the Indus Valley civilization went extinct, as part of the so-called Aryanized Bharat, as part of the so-called Aryavarta, the Brahmavarta, the Bharatvarsha, so to speak. So nobody has been able to conclusively establish that there was never a relationship between the Indus Valley civilization and the subsequent Vedic civilization, or which was older. I think the discussion is still going on. Therefore, independent of the politics of pushing the Aryan invasion theory in a state like Tamil Nadu, where it has effectively played a role in shaping up certain political currents, I don't think the people who pushed for that strongly were even remotely qualified to speak on that, were even remotely aware of what they were talking, because they latched on to what Max Muller said, but they never ever asked themselves. Max Muller himself has retracted his position with respect to Aryan being a racial concept. Why are we now hugging this dead cactus and constantly saying there is an Aryan, there is a Dravidian, there is an Aryan, there is a Dravidian? Why don't they look at other markers? So I'm not going to say that this is right or that is wrong, because frankly speaking, I think the jury is out in the open as far as which theory is valid. But if you really want to push a yet to be proven Aryan invasion theory in the political discussion, and you effectively want to push it even as part of a caste-related discussion, then I must respond to it by saying, if that is fair game according to you, then all the literature that effectively goes against the Aryan invasion theory is also capable of being hurled back at you, and for it to be flung back at you to ask you, how much do you really know about what you're talking about? Or are you simply quoting from third-party sources? Are you quoting from secondary propositions without even having read those propositions? Are you even qualified to speak on genetics? Are you qualified to speak on linguistics? Are you qualified to speak on migration patterns? If not, I think you must wait for a final opinion, or you must at least say that this is still unproven, this is still untested. If you lack that humility, then effectively you're pushing a political propaganda or a political agenda. Next.
So, in the search for a unifying civilization like Bharat, a colonial endeavor in and of itself?
Come again, sorry?
So, is the search for a unifying colonizational like Bharat a colonial endeavor in and of itself? By
No.
Srinivas Reddy.
No, it's not. To find a unifying factor is not let's say, a colonizing experience in itself. It is certainly not an attempt to try and other anyone. It is not to try and exclude anyone from this particular process. But it is really surprising that we are more than happy to speak of the origins of Incas. We are more than happy to speak of the origin of the Latin American civilizations. But the moment we start speaking of the origins of the Indian civilization and whether at all there was a concept of Indian civilization, we are being told, isn't this a way of excluding certain others who have become part of the society? Isn't this a way to actually create a new form of colonialism, a new form of imperialism, a new form of nationalism, a new form of ethnocentric nationalism? Sorry, in fact, you can't even make these accusations, because the moment you speak of Indian civilization, it goes beyond ethnic markers. It goes beyond racist markers. It goes beyond racial markers. It effectively translates to an idea becoming all-pervasive and not a certain ethnicity becoming all-pervasive. That is effectively what the literature tells you the more you read it. And the more you read it, you'll also come to this conclusion that words such as Dravida and several, let's say, words that are constantly used to effectively say, no, this is North, this is South, this is Arya, this is Dravida. The fluidity of this use in literature tells you that this was effectively a certain idea expanding its presence over a certain geography, as opposed to some imperial army going about destroying people and pushing them from the north to south, the whites effectively pushing the blacks to the south. This nonsense, frankly speaking, has been questioned by several historians, even from the south. In fact, let me go to two fantastic scholars in this particular regard. In fact, I would call them Dalit scholars, but more than anything, I would call them Indian scholars because they've contributed immensely to our understanding of Indian history. You should actually read Dr. Ambedkar's Who Were Shudras. His book is called Who Were Shudras, and he was effectively looking at this entire question is who the Shudras were and what are their origins. In his discussion, he rejects the Aryan invasion theory. And he also goes on to trace the fact that the so-called Shudras or the Chaturvarnas, the people in the fourth rung of the ladder, are people who have fallen from grace because of multiple reasons, because their gotras seem to sometimes even match the Kshatriya gotras. That was Dr. Ambedkar's reading of it. So sometimes those people who claim to be Ambedkarites and also speak of the Aryan invasion theory, I suspect they're speaking from both sides of their mouth, because I don't think they have actually understood the concept at all, or they've understood what is it that they're talking about. Dr. Ambedkar's best point, according to me, and his significant contribution, was that wherever he felt that there was a paucity of knowledge on his part, or wherever there is a paucity of, let's say, information on his part, he was humble enough to admit that he was not particularly trained in the subject, but he certainly started asking certain fantastic questions which are important. The other person that you must look at is there was this Pune Pact that was entered into by Dalit leaders around the time that separate electorates were being discussed for let's say, the so-called untouchables of that particular time, to say that there must be reservations for untouchables which are political in nature and they must be given separate electorates. At that time, MC Raja, a Dalit activist from Tamil Nadu at that particular point in time, he was the one to prevent attempts at conversion of Dalits. And he had a frank discussion on this issue with Dr. Ambedkar, which is captured extensively in history. And he effectively said, we are not asking for abolition of caste, nor are we saying that we want to destroy the Hindu system, nor are we saying that we want to stop being Hindus. We are effectively saying our caste identity is no less compared to any other identity, and we must be respected at par with other identities, and therefore we must get our place under the sun. We must get our position in the Hindu society. So this literature effectively busts two things. One, the so-called racial origins of the Aryan Dravidian theory is something that somebody like Ambedkar effectively destroys. And he says, sorry, I don't think there is any basis for it. A reading of India's history, a reading of India's caste structure and its hierarchy, and the fluidity of the caste hierarchy tells you that there is something else that has happened, and perhaps we don't have enough awareness of it, there is not enough research that has gone into it. And the other Dalit voice effectively comes to the conclusion to say, our goal is for Dalit pride as part of the Hindu society, not Dalit pride independent of the Hindu society or the Hindu identity. Unfortunately, none of these Dalit voices which spoke on these issues have found any place in our current history textbooks, and their positions on such important and delicate issues have been thrown into the dustbin. Nobody wants to talk about it because it doesn't fit the current narrative. Next.
Sir, was it a lack of confidence or a conscious strategy to retard this decoloniality for 70 years, for greater than 70 years of our independence?
So, with respect to the confidence, I think the confidence with respect to, let's say, 70 years, why is it that we have not undertaken this particular issue? Let me address it as bluntly and as provocatively as possible. If it hurts a few sentiments, so be it. I don't have a problem with it. I think the MHRD, the NCERT, and other departments have been significantly hijacked by cultural Marxists, and who continue to dominate the humanities departments in several institutions today, including in several technological institutions today, such as the IITs. And therefore, these Marxists prevent anybody from reinventing or rediscovering India's history or revisiting India's history, because it effectively comes in the way of their pursuit of a certain agenda. It comes in the way of their worldview. It comes in the way of what they believe should be the only way in which Indian history should be understood, I reject that approach completely. The Marxist way is not the only way, and I certainly don't agree that the Marxist way is the right way. Whether it is right or wrong is for future to decide, but others have their right and must be given an opportunity to present their positions with respect to history. For 70 years under the Nehruvian secular or socialist dispensation, not even secular, that was remotely secular, the Nehruvian socialist dispensation, no other institution, no other point of view, no other let's say school of thought has been given an opportunity. So those people who speak for dissent, who speak for free speech, who want freedom of expression and diversity of thought, should be the first ones to give other points of view an equal opportunity to be presented. Let the public draw its own conclusions. Let people examine the validity of these positions. However, that can't happen as long as you remain the guardian of the gateway who prevents people from having access to any of these institutions or portals. That is effectively what has happened for the last 70 years. Next.
So, when everyone is fine while protecting our linguistic heritage, for example, Tamilians want to protect their language.
Right.
No one calls them anti-India. There are non-Tamilians in Tamil Nadu. That doesn't mean Tamilians who don't want to protect the language are anti-non-Tamilians.
I'll try and answer your question. I hope I have a question. See, the thing is, the people of Tamil Nadu, frankly, are extremely open-minded people. They are immensely proud of their language, as anyone else should be. There's nothing wrong with it. And I think merely because they say that at least in our state, Tamil must get the right of preference, that must be the first language that people understand, there's nothing wrong with it. However, I think people have seen through the hypocrisy of political leaders where they insist and they expect their children to learn English and Hindi and whatnot, but they don't want Tamilians to learn other languages. It has come to a point where Tamilians have to find opportunities of employment outside that state. Therefore, if not, let's say, ideology, at the very least, commerce and requirements of opportunity, or let's say requirements of employment, are forcing you to learn different languages. And the more they start coming out of the state and they start interacting with outsiders, the more they realize that what is wrong in learning a certain language. I am not going to support imposition of any one particular language on anybody at the expense of any other language. But at the end of the day, if you live in India, at the very least, you're expected to know more than one language. That's the benefit of being an Indian. That's the advantage of being an Indian. Especially if you're from a city like Hyderabad, or if you're from a city like Bangalore, at the very least, you will know 2 to 3 languages. Kannada, Tamil, Telugu, Hindi, whatnot, you will have to learn it. There's no other option at all. So I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Please do understand that there are several people of non-Tamil origin, the Gujaratis and the Saurashtrians, who have lived in in Tamil Nadu for such a long time, that they're much more comfortable with Tamil as a language than their own mother tongues. Okay, and they themselves feel that this is a language that must get its due. So there's nothing wrong with it. The problem, I think, what has happened over a point of time is that the Aryan invasion theory and the Aryan-Dravidian divide, so to speak, has now translated, and for the very long time, in fact, since 1950s when the anti-Hindi agitation started, has effectively become, or it has manifested itself even in the language sphere. So therefore, while there are certain concerns which are legitimate about vanishing presence of native languages, I don't think that is effectively reflected in killing an interest in any other language or in saying, let's not learn any other language. That is something that I will never stand for. However, the question that we should perhaps be asking is, what has the state government of Tamil Nadu done over the years, apart from having certain symbolic days to say this is the World Tamil Day and whatnot? What have you done to offer professional courses in Tamil Nadu in Tamil? What have you done to ensure that state government hospitals which have doctors are effectively people who understand Tamil as a language and who have understood medicine in Tamil? What have you done? What kind of impetus has the state of Tamil Nadu given to the Siddha School of Medicine, which effectively traces its origins to Tamil Nadu and Kerala for the most part of it? Why is it that we don't ask these central questions? The moment you create a professional or an economic incentive for the use of a language as part of somebody's profession, you make sure that that particular language has longevity, you make sure that particular language has currency, you make sure that that language continues to live in several spheres. That is the reason why English is so alive in India. So that is something. Anybody who wants to protect that particular language should take these real steps. What is the point of constantly whining or cribbing about Hindi, when there are real steps that you as a state government can take to improve the status of your own language in that particular state. What have you done? So taking a position which is adversarial and pits you against the rest of the country makes very little sense when there is so much within your power that you can do. Why is it that you have not done? You've gone to the extent of at one stage under another, they wanted a separate country altogether. That was atrocious. That was a secessionist movement and a secessionist scheme which I can never stand for. And after that, what have you done? How much have you done to improve it? So every year they come out with one or two SOPs. We will give a certain cess or a rebate on entertainment tax for movies which have titles in Hindi or sorry in Tamil and not any other language. That is just symbolism. Beyond that, you have to do something more. So I think this is something that can be argued till the cows come home. All I'm trying to say is that if you're serious in your intent and you're committed to protecting your language, there is a lot that you can do without effectively alienating any other language. There is a lot that you can do without necessarily mocking any other language or people who speak that particular language. We are a part of the same country. There is no point in mocking each other's languages.
Professor Bhaskar Datta asks, how will you suggest mainstreaming indigenous therapies in our educational pedagogy? We seem to vacillate between trying to completely justify or align these along Western scientific paradigm or make balanced exaggerations that are not claimed as such either. The essence of many indigenous forms of medicine gets lost in such politically colored discourses.
See, at the very least, when it comes to certain forms of medicine, I would suggest that we approach it as a system of knowledge independent of any religious views. There's no denying the fact that there could be religious aspects to it, because at the end of the day, mathematics has its own form called ethnomathematics, where the influence of religion or Christian thought on mathematics is discussed. The influence and impact of, let's say, non-Christian thought on mathematics is influenced. Why is it that the concept of shunya is effectively related to the Indian school of thought? There are certain aspects to it. However, when it comes to Ayurveda, when it comes to, let's say, Siddha or other forms of Indian medicine, I think there is a huge bias because of our attachment to the allopathic form of treatment and allopathic form of medicine for generations now. Okay, and there are several misconceptions in our head that allopathic medicine is the only form of medicine and every other form of medicine is the alternate form of medicine. So that is problematic, that the native school of medicine has become the alternate form of medicine. Going back to the Chinese example, something that you might want to search, look up and read up on, is that practitioners of Chinese school of medicine are allowed to treat people if they are diagnosed with corona at the same level and with the same extent as, let's say, an allopathic practitioner. Whereas an Ayurvedic practitioner in this country will have to go through 100 different protocols before being able to treat someone who is displaying signs of corona. And he is in fact almost expected to refer that patient who has come to him voluntarily to an allopathic doctor. That means an Ayurvedic doctor or an Ayurvedic Vaidya, a practitioner, is expected to treat herself or himself as a secondary practitioner of a secondary form of medicine, notwithstanding the fact that that is the native form of medicine. Imagine, that's the ignominy that they have to go through in this country. Okay, there will be the funny part is, or the irony is, other countries which see value in Ayurveda will effectively exploit it, will commercialize it, and will mainstream it, and we will be the ones to effectively wonder, oh, now here goes another Indian form of knowledge into another Western entity. Nobody else is to be blamed for it. We are the ones who are to be blamed for it. So there is a huge political disincentive that is supported by a pharmaceutical disincentive, wherein nobody wants to see Ayurveda or other forms of Indian medicine become mainstream. And the ones who are genuinely interested in it are outnumbered, they are in the minority, and they have to face a lot of troubles from the ecosystem, from the establishment, regardless of who is in power. It doesn't make a difference who is in power. Ask yourself, we have constantly spoken of a need for a vaccine for corona, but we have never asked, why is it that the government is not doing enough to push the Ayush mechanism and the Ayush ministry, so to speak, to come out with indigenous cures for corona? At the very least, there are any number of ways of prescribing compositions to improve the immunity levels so that people don't contract corona the way they are currently and the pace at which they're currently doing. These are legitimate questions and these are fair questions. Every government, I would say so, is equally guilty of it. And those who say they stand for Bharatiya Sanskriti must then take up upon themselves the responsibility to push for Ayurveda and to push for Siddha medicines as much as possible. That is not happening, which is why I think it's a fundamental hypocrisy on the part of these dispensations. On the one hand, they keep saying Bharat Mata ki jai, and on the other hand, where they have the opportunity to do a lot for Bharat Mata using Bharatiya forms of knowledge, they're not doing enough. So at the end of the day, this is only symbolism.
Sir, it will be great to know where do you see the V.D. Savarkar's work on Indian nationalist philosophy and his definition, who is Hindu, in the works on decoloniality?
So Savarkar's work is relevant and it is certainly important. But I would look at the works of people who were relatively more apolitical in their approach, because that effectively gives people the confidence that they're reading something which has a scholarly basis to it. See, assume for a moment that I come here and I say stuff which is constantly politically loaded and I don't give anything which is objective and I don't give anything which is factual. Then how do you expect the audience to try and understand the underlying sentiment, the underlying facts? Effectively, I will have the effect of turning away the audience and shutting the minds of the audience, and they'll say, sorry, he's an agent of a certain point of view, we don't wish to listen to him. If you want to include more people in a discussion, if you want to include more people in a certain conversation, I think the conversation must happen with more emphasis on facts, with more emphasis on honesty, as opposed to taking the entire discussion in a negative manner. I'm not saying Savarkar is guilty of taking the discussion in a negative or a polarizing manner. However, I'm trying to say when there are other more scholarly sources which can help you arrive at a more informed conclusion on the very same issue, I would perhaps read Savarkar as a part of all this literature, but I will not make Savarkar the cornerstone of my knowledge and understanding on this particular issue. Because remember, Savarkar was not a historian. Gandhi was not a historian. Dr. Ambedkar, for that matter, was not a historian. Rabindranath Tagore was not a historian. They may be powerful individuals who had a certain impact on national life. That doesn't make them a historian. That doesn't make them historians. You have to respect them for their strengths. History was not exact. They may have respected history. They may have understood the value of history. Doesn't mean that they were students of history or trained students of history or trained historians. Look at a Jadunath Sarkar, an R.C. Majumdar, a Radha Kumud Mukherjee, a Neelakanta Shastri, a V.V.S. Iyer, a B.S. Rao, a Harbal Sarda, any of these people, a lot of these people coming from across the country. Look at indigenous sources. Sources which have been written in Assamese, sources which have been read in Hindi, sources which have been read in Kannada. They will tell you how they saw their culture, whether they saw it as part of a broader tapestry or whether they saw themselves as separate entities altogether. Nobody saw themselves as part of separate entities. If Ramayana and Mahabharata exist in more than 17 or 18 languages across the country, spread across several regions, clearly there was a unifying cultural marker, because you effectively ask yourself, who are our heroes who we worship? Who are the villains in our headspace? What are the epics that we look up to? What is the source of our morality and ethics? That's how you try and understand a civilizational point of view.
So, do you think that the opinions or notions held by the Constituent Assembly about India, Indian society, and especially Hinduism are firstly justified, and secondly were similar to those held by the majority of population? And how far do you think that they were free of this colonial prism you spoke of? What are your thoughts?
So this will be the last question because I have a moot court to judge after this. Students are waiting for me in a different law school. So I'll take this as the last question. I'm still trying to examine this particular proposition. My reading so far has been that the document called the Constitution is not a rootless, deracinated document. I don't think that document is as let's say irreligious and as secular as it is made out to be in the manner we understood both these. We understand both these terms today. The language effectively tells us that India has adopted for itself a certain identity. And I've said this in my piece that the first 5 parts of the Constitution, going until the parts relating to directive principles of state policy and fundamental duties, or at least directive principles of state policy, parts which relate to gender, caste, religion, fundamental rights, citizenship, and India's territory and India, that is Bharat, tell me and they educate me that they are very, very clear about the identity of Bharat. It is not a country which says that I have no identity for myself and anybody and everybody can come here and say that this belongs to them or that they're part of this particular country. There are very specific definitions. In fact, a lot of scholars from the Marxist side and the cultural Marxist side have in fact written that there is a Hindu bias in the constitution. That's what they have said. And these are the very same people who are now arguing that no, the constitution has no sense of identity, the constitution has no sense of civilizational identity. How can you say on the one hand that the constitution has a Hindu bias and on the other hand also say that the constitution has no identity, has no sense of religion and all that? Both these statements are contradictory. So you read the history of the drafting of the constitution, but please don't start from the Constituent Assembly debates because that is a later part. There is a significant discussion that went on from early 1946, even before that, when the Cabinet Mission was proposed in May 1946, until the Constituent Assembly started the Constituent Assembly debates on the 15th of November 1947. So much of the work was produced which will effectively tell you that all these committee reports, the Sapru Committee report, then you're looking at the sub-advisory committee on the subcommittee on fundamental rights, the subcommittee on minority rights, the subcommittee on gender rights. If you look at all these aspects, in fact, minority, gender, and all of this, you will realize that when these founding framers of the Constitution, men and women, that's why it's not founding fathers, they were very clear about the civilizational identity of the country, and they were also clear that every language in this country has a common reservoir that it draws from and contributes to. And in fact, Mr. Lokanath Mishra, one of the brilliant members of the Constitution, of the Constituent Assembly, the father of Mr. Pinaki Mishra, who's an MP from Odisha today, and the brother of Justice Ranganath Mishra, he specifically said that Sanskrit is the language which we must adopt, and if we fail to do so at this juncture, then we will effectively create a situation where not only do we alienate the entire country from a language to which this country is identified with, but most importantly, a language which has a nexus with every other language, almost every other language of this particular country, which is why all of the languages are called Desha Bhashas, whereas Sanskrit is called Deva Bhasha. So anybody who's understood or who's read Telugu literature, they will relate to this particular proverb or this particular usage which says Desha Bhasha the Telugu Lassa, which effectively says that Telugu is the most beautiful language among Desha Bhashas. That is those languages which are spoken in different parts of the Desha and the Pradeshas. But nobody denied the umbilical cord that existed between Indian languages, the rest of the Indian languages and Sanskrit. That is a later invention, and that is largely a creation of the Aryan-Dravidian divide, and that's largely a creation of the politics of Dravidianism that started in 1917 along with the Russian Revolution and the Justice Party movement and the self-respect movement in Tamil Nadu. So my point is, a lot of it is loaded with politics. People haven't really done their reading. So they have their own notions of what is the relationship between Sanskrit and Telugu and all the southern languages. But I don't think they're even remotely qualified to actually speak on the subject because they're not trained to talk about it. So anyways, I think I've taken enough time, and I'm grateful to.
Can you take just one very good question regarding this talk. Nonika Das is asking.
I'm sorry, I can't take this question because I think I've already overshot my time. There's a moot court that students are waiting for. I don't like to keep other students waiting, so I'll have to.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, sir. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all the professors.
I'm grateful to everyone for a patient hearing. Those who did not like my views and those who feel that these views don't necessarily sit well with their point of view, it's for you to either take them or buy them or reject them. I don't have a problem. I'm grateful to every person who has taken the time to sit and listen to this, and the organizers for giving me an opportunity to interact with a brilliant bunch of students. Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.